I think that just as we're living in a nuclear age, we have grown so tremendously in scientific knowledge, it doesn't seem too much to say that men can begin to awaken to the fact that they haven't grown enough spiritually and haven't recognized their spiritual capacities.
Once something like eating is death, then you've struck at the very heart of life. The enemy of the older radical theories may have been the ruling class, but today the stakes of whether we will reform ourselves into a new kind of human being, a new kind of society, whether we will find selves worth being, the stakes of it are simply life itself.
As modernity has created promises that it has no ability to keep. What this means is that we're a society of disembedded individuals, stuck in the impossible situation of being alone together. And what was understood as emancipation has proved to be a form of isolation. It is important to understand that what I am telling you is not simply a cultural history. It's a description of the story that shapes every single person that you know. This is why there is a rise in mental illness. It's absolutely concurrent with the disembedding of the individual, because individuals can't constitute themselves by the very nature of the case. Subjectivity cannot sustain its own weight. We need others to tell us. But we've been given an ethical mandate by the Enlightenment that tells us that that's immoral, that nobody should constrain us.
So we are on episode 11 of season 2 of Dustbowl Diatribes. And over the arc of this season, the fuller season has had a lot to do with our interviews with various Christian pastors and other Christian thinkers. And we have talked to them, especially about matters of community building, and the environment. And so I thought we could start with that, Spencer, if you don't mind, talking about their takes on the environment, because for us at the Morin Academy, we try to keep the environment's situation foremost in our minds, and a top priority, because it is the one thing that we cannot get around, or should not be able to try to get around sort of mentally. It's a fact that we are experiencing worse and worse symptoms of human-induced climate change, and it's affecting our environment now, and it's going to affect our children's environment even more, their lives and their livelihoods. It threatens our existence ultimately, and it's underway. And so it's something that any Christian pastor or serious Christian thinker needs to also keep foremost in their minds. And I think, a lot of times what we see is we see people kind of using the Christian belief in original sin and the flawed nature of humanity, our limitedness, as kind of an excuse to not think about that, or to just sort of say, well, we can't really do anything about that. There's not much we can do. All we can do is more or less safeguard our souls, do what small things we can in our own immediate environment, stay close to God, and let the rest fall to Him. And to a certain extent, we saw that type of response come out in some of these interviews, I guess. Wouldn't you say?
I would say all of them.
Yeah, in one way or another.
To greater or lesser degree, yeah. And including the mini season with the Midtown Kansas City stuff.
Yeah, and in other words, like in those, it was kind of like, in my own little neck of the woods, I can do this, but it really doesn't amount. It's not ultimately going to amount to a whole lot, but that's all I can do. Is that kind of what you're referring to?
Right.
Yeah.
Like liberal realism / capitalist realism, where the idea is I'm just an individual, and to the extent I even conceive of solving problems. It is at best linking up with other liberal individuals and forming some sort of movement or interest group to lobby for the changes that I believe should happen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that's sort of the best I can do. And then it's up to larger movements or larger developments that I can't really control. There was a tendency, maybe especially with the smaller kind of season within a season that wasn't related specifically to pastors, to want to say this is a job for interest groups, for the government, like you said, lobbying, right? Whereas I think the pastors were, I mean, frankly, like there was a lot of just plain pregnant pauses when we asked the question about the environment. You know, when we asked a question like, well, so what do you teach your people about environmental issues or climate change? And some of them, you know, there was this pause followed by, in some cases, you know, a little bit of an attempt, and in some cases, just like, well, we just don't deal with that, right?
And to connect what you're saying to what I was saying, how could they? Because like the earth and even your like bioregional climate is more than you as an individual can relate to. Like it doesn't fit inside of the categories that we live our lives in.
True. It's difficult, which is why people want to try to move, understandably, to the organizational and political level. And I don't think either one of us are totally against that. We just often observe that seems like there's a certain futility to that all of those interest groups and lobbying and all those moves that people make are not really slowing this thing down very much, because the overall interest of the economy is just so militates against it so hard. But you know, to get back to the point of organizational level, that's I think why I wanted to hear what churches as organizations were doing and how they taught their people about this, right? Because you would think that they would have more, you know, clout or ability. And if anything, like I remember Reverend Compier, you know, did say like his church, Episcopalian, am I right? Episcopalian, they do like encourage people to do those kinds of things, but it's this strategy of, you know, you do need to like join this group and help lobby Congress or something like that, right? So it amounted to still a liberal strategy of like that kind of political pressure, which is not the same as a church as, I mean, to use the language like the body of Christ doing things themselves.
Mm-hmm.
That seems really hard for people. Nobody went there, if I'm not mistaken, right?
No. I would say no one even approached that.
Yeah. Like I would say Mundal, not on the environment, but on like housing the poor, tried for like 1 year. So we'll be talking about that later, about like Mundal's failed experiment, which he, you know, did do. So I would put him in a category of guy tried something, right? But
right. And to be fair, how could they? Because then you're asking your parishioners that are dominated by the abstract domination of capital to live their lives differently. And that's literally not allowed.
And yet the alternative is literally, you know, disaster. Ultimately, the threat is absolute disaster, which we're experiencing even now more and more. So like, how couldn't they, is my response to that.
Because they don't, I mean, I said it at some point during that post-mortem, because they don't have that apocalyptic mentality.
Mm-hmm.
They have more what we all have to various degrees are what Alan Bloom called debonair nihilism. So we're just whistling past the graveyard.
Wow, what a picture. Debonair nihilism. Yeah, well, you know, I don't know how many people are as conscious as that of it, but I mean, that's kind of the effect, right? Is a sort of deep ingrained cynicism that sits side by side with a certain, at least rhetorical optimism about, you know, who we are and what we can do. We're people of God. We're preaching the word. We're getting God's love out there into the world. So there's that kind of like superficial optimism, you might say. And then if you're right, beneath the surface is this, we can't really accomplish anything big here, right?
Right.
So there's topics that we won't talk about because, like, they repeatedly said, you know, like one way or the other, they would say, well, if we talk about this, we'll just lose people. Or if we talk about this, we'll get like told on to the bishop, or, you know, we'll have people, you know, attack us and we'll be fired, right? So there's this kind of like deep compromise with the existing political and economic reality that they do.
Right. And then that deep compromise is usually not even conscious on most people's part. And then if it is conscious, they've done the mental gymnastics to convince themselves that it's either it's natural and therefore you can't stop it, or it's just good and right and like the best way to order things. So, and to be clear, we're not critiquing so much like any individual pastor or theologian we interviewed, but this is where most people's, you know, it reminds me, I guess we can briefly share. We got at the JP2 Catholic Worker Farm, we got our first critical email of a guy who didn't like, first he was excited that there was a farm named after John Paul II. And then when he saw we were sort of, I'm not even clear exactly where he found this, but he found out we were like co-marketing the Morin Academy's Jacob Honshu's Mark's Capital Reading Group. He wrote an email to inform us that, you know, we were doing a bad thing.
Didn't he told you to watch Bishop Barron and Word on Fire to kind of cure your ill-begotten ways?
Yeah, he said I want to dwell just briefly on this because he says some things about himself, but he says, I took a course in college called Socialism and Catholicism and Dialogue, which on the one hand, like good, but part of it, I think, was like establishing his credentials that he took a class. And he says, and I'm disillusioned with the two political parties. And I really want to, let's come back to that. I'm just, because that's one of these moves to be like, oh, I see through the problems. I see how ambiguous the situation is. And then it's like, fine. And then is that the end? Is that the end of wisdom here? And basically he's like, I sympathize with, you know, exploring other ideas, but I think you should reconsider naming this enterprise after the Pope that stood perhaps most strongly against Marxist theory, or remove serious discussion of Marxism from the official farm bio. I'm not exactly clear what he means by official farm bio. And then he immediately goes on to, you may be familiar with Catholic theology and teachings enough to know arguments about against Marxism, but I'm going to share Bishop Robert Barron's episode addressing the subject below.
Yeah, I don't think Marxism is in the JP2's bio, whatever that is on your website. I'm pretty sure
he might. Emily's guess is he's referring to our Instagram bio or Instagram page.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah. Well, notice that he took a class on socialism when he was in college, and I guess by his own advice, he shouldn't have done that, right? Like, because there's nothing to be gained and it's kind of evil, and therefore stay away from it. But actually, the only way that you would know what you think about it is if you actually learned about it, which he did. And so did John Paul II, by the way.
Right. Although, to be fair, I don't think, no, because he says, I sympathize and I believe in reading opposing views to better argue against them. That was a quote. His more objection is that I think we're like being sacrilegious or something by having Marxist stuff and naming ourselves JP2. Like we're like betraying his legacy.
JP2 is kind of known amongst Catholics to be the great anti-communist pope because of What he did, of course, he came from communist Poland, occupied Poland. And he came to Poland during the uprising against communism and really got it started there, praying with the people, encouraging the labor unions there. And it really was instrumental in starting it. And of course, Pope John Paul was critical of Soviet communism. But that doesn't mean that he was any different from a lot of his predecessors when it came to Catholic social teaching. And he was critical of capitalism too. And that's something that most admirers of JP2 ignore. And as a matter of fact, there's manuscripts that have come to light from the 1950s when he was teaching in Poland, in which he covered Marxist and other socialist thought, and provided a real assessment of Catholic social teaching and showed how in line his thinking was with it. So he was fully informed about Marxism, and he understood its flaws and limitations, but he also understood the limitations of capitalism. And that doesn't come through in the popular image. People just think that he was, pro-capitalism and anti-communism. But he was Pope John Paul II. He was a lot smarter than that. He had a much more sophisticated position.
Right. And it's that, to me, the irony is it's the people that have this neocon perspective, which is really pushed. I mean, I would argue, like, one of my critiques of JP2 is that he had a lot of like wolves in his company, and it's that neoconservative story, the fable that he was pro-capitalism, that he affected a revolution in Catholic social teaching by just accepting that capitalism was inherently good. That's the stance of his official biographer.
And so your theory is that he allowed people to kind of shape his message in that direction?
In practice, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Clearly he did. And I think it's partly, I think the trads are right when they want to critique the communio people of being overly optimistic that dialoguing with people will lead to fruitful changes on their dialogue partner's part.
Mm-hmm. Because people will inevitably distort and shape and use the message however they want.
Right.
Yeah.
Because they're basically so hard-hearted. And so, for instance, so then you get this image, like that's, I think, what's coming through on this guy's email, that the suggestion on his part, I think, was that we're betraying JP2's legacy by sort of blasphemously associating him with communism, whereas my position is actually that may be true if that's what we're doing. And I doubt it. And that's what you're bringing into question. Are we doing that? But to me, the counter question is actually, are you blasphemously associating JP2 with a pro-capitalist stance / a pro-American stance that he in fact did not hold?
Yeah, well, of course, right? JP2 then becomes this political football, like all the other, thinkers like him seem to become, where people have these alternating, interpretations of their thought that basically twist it. That happens. I mean, as a political theorist, I can tell you that has happened to every great thinker as they get used, their message gets twisted. And then, sadly, also for people like us, going back to the original, like, let's say that I spent the next 2 years of my life elucidating John Paul II's Catholic social teaching, right? Mm-hmm. And went back to those manuscripts, which are now, by the way, only in Polish, but hopefully will be translated soon. And I showed how, his thinking is continuous with, that teaching, and that he was not ardently pro-capitalist as he's made out to be. I just wouldn't get any traction. Okay. People spend their entire lives trying to convince others, and I've done a lot of it, that most of what they think about these types of people is not true, thinking that if they only know the truth about who they really were and what they really thought, that they'd have to change their minds. But that doesn't actually happen.
Mhm.
They just change the subject or they ignore you. So, it doesn't work.
Right. And even if they are, this triggered me kind of like going back over my priors a little bit. And I just want to say, even if they are open to you, and if they start kind of thinking for themselves instead of these simplistic narratives they've inherited by like ideological forces generally, then the problem is they're kind of in a wilderness where now they have to like confront ambiguous realities. So like, for instance, in paragraph 42 of Centesimus Annus, which the neocons tend not to quote, John Paul II wrote, returning now to the initial question, can it perhaps be said that after the failure of communism, capitalism is the victorious social system, and that capitalism should be the goal of the countries now making efforts to rebuild their economy and society? Is this the model which ought to be proposed to the countries of the third world, which are searching for the path to true economic and civil progress? And true, that's an important modifier. One more paragraph. The answer is obviously complex. If by quote unquote capitalism is meant an economic system which recognizes the fundamental and positive role of business, the market, private property, and the resulting responsibility for the means of production, as well as free human creativity in the economic sector, then the answer is certainly in the affirmative, even though it would perhaps be more appropriate to speak of a business economy, market economy, or simply free economy. But if by quote unquote capitalism is meant a system in which freedom in the economic sector is not circumscribed within a strong juridical framework, which places it at the service of human freedom in its totality, and which sees it as a particular aspect of that freedom, the core of which is ethical and religious, then the reply is certainly negative. And I bring that up because what is your read? Do you want to believe that like the American constitutional framework, and even if you believe that, have we sufficiently preserved that framework up, through the Civil War and through the various amendments, and then does that latter paragraph describe American capitalism? And you and I say no, it does not.
Yeah, it doesn't describe the current state of capitalism, really, or the past stage, but certainly not the neoliberal stage. I mean, there's some regulation in the neoliberal system, but it's primarily to the advantage of major corporate, interests, and not the kind of businesses that, say, Catholic social teaching or distributist thinking would have in mind, to like encourage the flourishing, right? So for the most part, not at all, right? And I don't think that people like that we're talking about would even see it as such. I don't think they've given it that much thought, if that makes sense.
Yeah. If they were confronted with this and they took it in, they'd have those pregnant pauses we were talking about.
Right. They wouldn't know. I mean, that's the most common response when dealing with a paragraph like that from somebody that you admire and they're not saying what you think they ought to say, is you just don't understand it and you just move on. You don't take the time to ask the question, would the American system and the American government's interference in the economy amount to what JP2 would want in the way of like regulation for, to ensure human development and welfare and things like that? They won't take the time to ask that question.
Right. Because if you were to go a few steps further, and to be fair, like people like Bishop Barron, they do have apologies for how capitalism actually functions. Like it's interesting how their critique of Marx, like both Larry Chapp and Bishop Barron, is to basically historicize him and be like, well, he was right that like early industrial revolution, yeah, kids were getting arms ripped off in factories, and yeah, nobody had a family wage, and yeah, there weren't any environmental regulations. But now look at America. Look how many people are housed. Look at how we do have, public schools, and look at how we've like humanized capitalism. And to be fair to them, there are sections of Centesimus Annus that do make that argument, that are coming from that perspective.
That observe that a lot of good things have come out of capitalism because it's created so much like material abundance that it's benefited people. Isn't that kind of like the argument there?
Right. And that basically there have been progressive reforms to capitalism.
Yeah. Right. Liberal sort of welfare reforms. But yeah, and that's a good point.
But the question.
Just a second. I just want to remind people that like private property, trade, the market, these things can exist outside of a capitalist system, and they did for centuries and centuries. So we're not talking about, Catholic social teaching being anti-private property, anti-market, anti-trade, or anti-free trade up to a certain point. And we're talking about a system that has to do with mass production and has to do with the advent of market imperatives that force people to, engage in the market in a certain way, get big or get out, compete or die, cut prices at all costs. And this is why Jacob Honshu's Marx reading group is important. It's not because Marx was ultimately right about what ought to be done, but you have to understand what capitalism is. And I think a lot of Catholics and other Christians think that when you're critical of capitalism, you're critical of private property per se.
That's one of the equivocations, yes.
Well, that's just obviously not true because private property has existed for millennia, but capitalism has only existed since about the 18th century at the earliest.
But this is where the capitalist realism sorts of mentalities get you.
Right. This is the way, in effect, this way of thinking and behaving is the way it's always been. And that's just not true. It's just not true.
And therefore, to meddle with it can only bring on disaster.
Right. We want to continue to have the goose that laid the golden egg here. It's producing tons of widgets and crap and junk and, horrible jobs and unemployment, but it's also producing the fact that, there are more people living well until recently. Now it's not the case, but living longer and, with less abject poverty, at least in the Western or in the developed world. Right. But not in other parts of the world necessarily. But, you could say that's the golden egg, right, that the goose has laid. So then I guess we're supposed to believe that we can do no better, that this is as far as we can go. And we just have to always contend with the fact of all these prices that the environment and other people pay for the egg. We get the egg, that's fewer people in abject poverty, along with all the junk, all the unemployment, all the poverty in other parts of the world,
all the social alienation.
Yeah, the climate change that's bringing about mass migrations and political turmoil, and on and on and on.
While the privileged people get sucked into techno-gnostic paranoid conspiracy theories.
Yeah, which is it's all tied in there.
And as that ripples out into our culture war between like the boaters and the brunchers that Matt Christman talks about. Yeah.
Yep. And it's all a price that we have to pay. It gets back to Wendy Brown. A long time ago, we read that book on The Undoing of the Demos, and she talked about responsibilization. Remember that? And it was like, if you feel the pain, of you've lost your job and you have to retool, or you don't have the money to buy that stereo system that your neighbor has, or whatever it is, well, it's just a sacrifice that you have to make. And ultimately, you are responsible because of the choices that you have made. So, we tell people it's all about your free choices. But, the reality is you don't have a lot of choices in this system. And shouldn't a Christian want to take the good of what we've done, which I will accept there has been some good to it, and get rid of some of the worst, horrible, gross parts of it and make it even better?
Yeah, but that would require them to, I mean, no, we are kind of seemingly contradicting what we said earlier on when we're complaining about like liberal realist subjects that say they don't have any power, and then them getting all these messages saying you're responsible for how things worked. And then you're saying, but they don't have any power. And the way through those two things is to be like, to some degree, we do have power. And the question is, can liberal subjects' power be linked up with other liberal subjects' power to create forms of social organization that can contest the way things actually are?
Right. Yeah. It sounds like a contradiction, but and maybe it is, but it's like also the reality of things that we are pitted against a system that's very, very, it seems almost ineluctable. It doesn't give us a lot of choices, but at the same time, if we're ever going to get out of this, it's going to come from the choices that we make. And so, we're not automatons, at least not yet. Right. Which is why, like, the difficulty of it is why I tend to be fixated on churches, right? I mean, because if there's any group in our society that ought to be concerned about this and ought to have the motivation and the wherewithal to do the kind of thing you're talking about, which is direct action, direct cooperation and action, the building up of sort of sub communities that can live differently, mm-hmm. and maybe involve more and more people. That can only be done by something as big as the Christian church.
Yeah. I mean, I can imagine other, Chris Cutrone would certainly argue other institutions are capable of doing that.
Yeah, we talked
or
to Chris
social forces.
Back, mm-hmm. which we ought to come back at some point. But
I don't think you're wrong that like out of any one group other than just Republicans and Democrats, like en masse, if those political parties actually wanted to challenge capitalism somehow or other, like if they had a revolution at the top, I suppose they could try and do something as well. But of course they don't, because they're complicit in the maintenance of the status quo. But
right. I guess I'm writing off the parties.
Sure.
Democrats abandon the working class and pretty much, I don't know. I mean, there's a reason why they're having a hard time hanging on to power. Let's just put it that way. So, and they talk about the environment, but they're, like what they propose to do and what they actually do are two different things. And there just hasn't been all that much action. So I'll admit to basically not putting any degree of hope in that side of things.
Sure. And you and I both as Catholics believe that like the church and the Eucharist and sacraments are what's D.L. Schindler's book, like heart of the world, center of the world, heart of the world.
I think heart of the world.
Yeah. Heart of the world, center of the church, maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that's where my ultimate commitments are. But no, the more I think about it, the more I think partly we're talking like revolutionaries in the sense of like we're like looking at how the world works and then we're trying to imagine how the world should work. And I increasingly think that that is not a normal. Most people are not that way.
Oh yeah, like
and then even fewer people that are that way go to become Catholics. But
that's true, because people tend to be attracted to Catholicism because they perceive it to be very traditional.
The opposite. Yeah. Actually, let me go run. I've been reading a John Rao book that it has such a poignant section on this topic.
Okay.
So this is called Removing the Blindfold, 19th Century Catholics and the Myth of Modern Freedom. Published by the press that I think is owned by the Society of Pius the Sixth. So those like schismatic or quasi-schismatic, semi-schismatic Catholic traditionalists. He has a section where so his story of modernity is that you have like revolutionary forces, which are everything, like to put it in modern political terms, his definition of revolutionary forces would be everybody from like Protestant traditionalists to libertarians to mainstream Republicans to mainstream Democrats to, even further to the left, that all these people are revolutionary because they have inherently absorbed like liberal Enlightenment tenets.
Okay.
So in his framework, this is a kind of like attempt to reformulate like what he considers like genuine Catholic counter-revolutionary thought, right? So pretty reactionary by most people's standards. But from within that, he says there's a split between, he has a section called shallow versus profound counter-revolutionary theory. And he writes that a serious look at the counter-revolution must begin with an acknowledgement of its notoriously divided character. There have been many different types of counter-revolutionaries from its earliest history. One strain, enormously influential among the rank and file, is so far removed from a profound intellectual discussion of philosophical and social problems that it cannot be treated seriously as having anything to do with counter-revolutionary thought. Thoughts italicized. I shall simply refer to this type of thoughtless counter-revolutionary activity as shallow, and briefly outline its general contours for the reader. It is true that counter-revolutionaries in general were friends of authority and of social order. Authority and order, however, can be defended from a variety of standpoints. Some people, those who I am identifying as shallow, defend them simply because they themselves might have lost great advantages if the then present authority and the then present order of things collapsed. Revolution threatened ever wider groups with harm and even total destruction in the course of the 19th and early 20th centuries. Those groups endangered by it often became counter-revolutionary, but only in the shallow sense. They simply wanted to save themselves. Each threatened group tended to conflate the problem of authority and order with the problem of its own self-interest. Each defined the war of the counter-revolution against the revolution as the struggle of its own established position in life against opposing interest. Each saw its own shallow, selfish, and perhaps even unjust issue as being the earth-shattering issue. The revolutionary depiction of the counter-revolutionary as a mindless defender of the status quo, and the counter-revolution itself as merely a cover for the exploitation of the have-nots by the haves, has consequently been a relatively simple matter. It has been a relatively simple matter because it is partly justified by the behavior of shallow counter-revolutionaries themselves. Similarly, it is true that counter-revolutionaries were generally friends of quote-unquote tradition, but one can also defend tradition from a variety of standpoints. Often, the shallow counter-revolutionary was attached to one particular traditional practice without understanding its connection with the other traditional practices, or the way in which it could be undermined by a seemingly abstract but erroneous philosophical concept. Worse still, sometimes the traditional practice beloved by the shallow was really not traditional in the true sense at all. Sometimes, as we shall see later, it was actually a moderate revolutionary idea, custom, or institution that seemed traditional because it had been rooted in a given place for a respectable period of time. As the revolution threatened ever greater numbers of traditional or seemingly traditional concerns and practices with harm or total destruction in the course of the last 2 centuries, each man who saw his favorite quote-unquote tradition assaulted became a counter-revolutionary. But once again, he often became a counter-revolutionary in the shallow sense. Thus, he confounded the defense of tradition with the maintenance of his cherished concern or practice alone. He made the counter-revolution a struggle over this one factor. His issue became the earth-shattering and definitive issue. If he momentarily won his case, he thought that the whole of the revolution had been defeated, when in fact he had struck only one of its 1,000 heads. And if the tradition he defended was actually not traditional at all, the would-be counter-revolutionary was in fact unwittingly lending a hand to his own destruction. There was, therefore, a natural division between the shallow and what I should like to call the profound counter-revolutionary. The profound counter-revolutionary based his defense of order, authority, and tradition upon serious principles. He became aware of the historical development of a correspondingly principled revolutionary attack upon the things he loved. He saw that revolution was not merely some peevish assault by the have-nots upon the haves, even though such envy might well have played a role in it. And just one more paragraph, almost there. As a result, he found himself constantly at odds with the bulk of the counter-revolutionary troops, who were shallow in their approach. He was unwilling to attribute to this or that specific self-interest or tradition the overriding importance assigned to it by his shallow compatriots. He spoke of deeply rooted problems when the troops wished to hear nothing of difficulties, subtleties, and long-term battles. The shallow wanted to be told that the front line was clearly visible before them, and that once it was taken, victory would be assured. As soon as they were informed that victory would not be won until the entire horizon was cleared of the enemy and the home front purged of fifth columnists, they became annoyed with and even suspicious of the informant. Hence, they turned for direction to shallow, quote-unquote, practical men who told them exactly what they wanted to hear, that the solution to the problem was easy.
Wow. It's not hard to see some of our current situation in those paragraphs. I don't know exactly what you would pull out, but like I was thinking about the Hydra, you know, with its many heads, and in our current context, how, you know, people strike a blow to, you know, getting rid of the constitutional right to an abortion. And then they think they've won the entire battle when they don't even know what they're battling against, really. But you tell me what you had in mind.
I mean, in the abstract, what he's laying out is that you can have these people that seemingly agree and seemingly want to fix the world, and yet most of the people are doing it for shallow reasons, and therefore they don't see the various contradictions. Like, okay, Dobbs has overturned Roe versus Wade. Does that mean every state gets to decide on what their abortion regulation is? And then does it mean that they could actually be more lax than Roe was? And then if so, is that a victory or is it not? And, you know, or similarly, you know, for the guy who emailed me, okay, you think communism is bad? You think maybe it was defeated or maybe not, but like compared to what?
Mm-hmm.
Compared to, is capitalism fine? Because really you're just a kind of counter-revolutionary who has meanwhile accepted, you know, whatever comes out of neoliberalism.
Yeah, that he really describes the sort of shallow conservatism that a lot of people have, where it's just my little world, what I perceive to be important at the moment, that's what I want to keep, right? Without any sort of overarching understanding of why, what ought to be defended, you know, or why it ought to be defended. And that's what gets us into trouble with things like, well, the abortion issue for sure. Because I mean, yeah, like it's never a victory to turn a very important moral question over to a democratic vote on any given year. It just isn't.
Mm-hmm. Which you would think that seems to be more or less the proper Catholic stance. And yet there were a lot of Catholics celebrating this.
Yeah. I don't get it.
Can I read just a couple more paragraphs from another section?
Yeah, sure.
It directly connects.
Okay.
So that was section C. This is section E. It's called interaction. Shallow and profound, secular and religious. He talks about how that was another distinction. There were some secular counter-revolutionaries and the religious ones. And of course, the religious ones are also divided. But shallow and profound, secular and religious denote distinctions that need to be made intellectually in order to present the arguments crucial to understanding the development of counter-revolutionary thought and action. Still, the reader must note that it is impossible to erect impenetrable walls between the various groups mentioned. Each had its influence on the others. Indeed, in practice, counter-revolutionaries sometimes moved back and forth from one to another of these camps, just as individual men can move from one attitude to another often contradictory one in the course of their normal troubled lives. Nevertheless, the main point remains the same. The tensions that resulted from such divisions prevented the counter-revolutionaries as a whole from acting cohesively over any length of time. Most importantly, they prevented it from turning to account its most telling intellectual point, the innate contradiction and self-deception of the revolutionary mentality. It was precisely this living lie of the revolution that was to be the chief focus of thinkers in the Catholic counter-revolutionary ranks. Now, the reason I'm bringing all this up is if we're right that most people are inherently anti-revolutionary, and yet more and more people have these kind of, they want some sort of revolution along the lines that they imagine. So they might think, yeah, I want to live in a world without plastic or without abortion or where we fix climate change or whatever. But they never go past that point to like, well, I guess I'm going to have to work with other people to make that vision a reality.
Right. They don't like see the bigger picture that you can't continue to live the way you are and achieve those goals, whether it's abortion or climate change, right? You can't live in a world, for instance, where men and women both are expected to work full time, have, achieve the middle class lifestyle or above, have a certain, therefore degree of, I mean, that's the ideal anyway, degree of material well-being, consume a bunch of stuff. You can't have that whole ball of wax, and not have the abortion problem, because in order to take care of women and children such that this is not needed would require a very tight-knit society where people trusted each other. And likewise, to prevent further damage to our environment, we'd have to value something that is our human relations, God, the immaterial things like love, far more than our stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And travel even. Okay. Like our cars, our planes, like we would have to change our entire value system and way of life. And that's what they don't want to see. They want to think, well, we can pass this, protocol, at the international level, right? If we just push our government to do that, we'll still be able to get all the things that we currently have and keep living the way we are and also stop this problem.
Mm-hmm.
But it's all...
And it's that shallow versus profound.
Right.
Yeah. And it's such a good sentence. I just want to read it again. The tensions that resulted from such divisions prevented the counter-revolutionaries as a whole from acting cohesively over any length of time.
Mm-hmm. Right. And we do have those. And so we bicker and quarrel over differences because people can't see that bigger picture.
Yeah. Or they get together and they're like, oh, the Democrats, they're so awful. Can't they see that abortion is wrong? There's a whole lot of like hating the other side.
There's a lot of hating the other side. And then there's even like plenty of divisions within the sides, just as an example that proves my point, most leftist organizations are rife with conflict, like amongst themselves. They eat each other alive. Mm-hmm. And, this is just... So the divisions and the demand that we get things absolutely right, get it right or get out, cripples all these organizations on the right and the left.
Mm-hmm. Mm. Yep, and on the margins of both of those things.
So would you? So you are basically characterizing us through this quotation as counter-revolutionary, aren't you?
I mean, I guess to the extent that like we're opposed to liberalism, but if we are on the side of JP2 and wanting basically what Marx derided as utopian socialism, again, I'm making some assumptions about the guy who emailed us suggesting we change our name or divest ourselves of Marxism. And I'm just treating him like a normal American Catholic. Is he worried about where the economy is going? And if he is worried, is his complaints that there's too much governmental regulation?
I'm guessing yes.
and if he is like a norm, then how does this fit in with Catholic social teaching consistently saying that people should be given a family wage?
Right.
Meanwhile, it
must be regulated or it will basically destroy itself. Yeah. I mean, that's the consistent teaching of the church.
And yet, where they are at a crossroads is then it's, do you abandon the political party that stands for stopping abortion, but also says, don't worry about family wages, don't worry about healthcare, don't worry about environmental regulations, don't worry about the fate of refugees we don't want to take in. I mean, that's their dope. And then you can, hence the sentence, I'm disillusioned with the two political parties. Oh, so it's like, okay, so you start to see through them, but then what?
Yeah, but that's a very typical statement for an American of any persuasion, is they're getting pretty disillusioned, because it's a very easy thing to say, right? Like, that gives you sort of an air of sophistication, like, oh, I'm tired of this. But nevertheless, like, this is the world in which I dwell. So,
Right.
I don't know. I can take that with a grain of salt.
Well, because I would argue it's another shallow mentality, in the sense of it would require consistently thinking about things, to the extent you can, consistently thinking about things at every level of reality, and trying to find some way to synthesize these things.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, if you did consistently try to live out Catholic social teaching, for one thing, you'd have to prefer smaller and local business. I know people equate that with some sort of socialism, and maybe it is. Maybe this is like the very leading edge of Christian utopian socialism or something. But consistently, like, buying the goods that you have to buy from those businesses and preferring them to corporate, even if they're more expensive and stuff like that. Even that, which is basically still a consumer change, right, is something that most people won't do consistently. We've already talked about that so much. There's not a lot of consistency there. Part of the season was talking about that.
Right. And especially with like with the interview with Farmer Dan Kroll, and then the post-mortem, the point was, you can't really do lifestyle anarchism. Even as an individual, you can try, and the wealthier you are, the more you can do parts of it, at least like the more ethical consumption. But I think what you're trying to say is they would start trying from the bottom up. You would do lifestyle anarchism, to which I'm like, okay, in theory, maybe that's possible. Can somebody show me where that's happening at any kind of scale? Yeah.
And no, like, outside of specialized religious communities, whether they're Catholic or otherwise, where that does happen because enough people have kind of gotten together and agreed to it. So, I mean, it's not like it totally doesn't happen at all. But even in those, there's not a complete detachment from the larger economy. But at least they're trying pretty hard,
Sure.
But beyond that, like, if you want to live a quasi-normal life, it's very, very hard to do, right? But however, that doesn't mean that you couldn't try, or that if you were somewhat taking the Catholic social teaching seriously, that wouldn't be a part of your overall approach. So anyway, don't want to
Sure. There's that, and I would argue, if you're like John Rao, who wrote this book, what you should also be doing is like joining up or starting like a subsidiarity party. And they do there is like a solidarity party, but they're like the right-wing equivalent of the DSA. And the hope is to more or less like push the right wing of the Republican Party in this direction. But meanwhile, you're a bunch of crazy people.
Interesting.
Socially in practice, because you would have to gather too many people around you, and too many people, or let me rephrase that, too many people are like shallow and they don't want to go that far, and it's unreasonable, and it would require too much sacrifice and too much work.
Yeah, well, in kind of along these lines, I went back and listened to our interview with Tom Lindahl, the Lutheran pastor who tried to get like a small Catholic worker kind of experiment off the ground at a university, more or less a Christian dorm or Christian living, where there were some empty rooms, and they did invite some people in, some homeless people, just a couple. It was a very, very small scale thing. And it lasted 1 year. And just kind of an example of how, here's a person who did try. And I think a lot of times on this podcast, we do a lot of, well, we tried this or this guy tried that and it failed. And we get this sense of like, we're just screwed, basically. There's nothing. I mean, we do tend to and I mean, there's a reason why we give off that vibe. It's because it is that hard. And I think we want people to know that. Mundao really gave it a good shot, but he was up against, donors and influential people who supported the student living, who didn't get why, like a Christian student living house would have an interest in bringing in these outside people. And ultimately they just didn't go for it and didn't support it. And it only lasted a year. And then I feel like Tom kind of took the lesson that sort of direct, out of the box action was just not really possible. So then he went to plan B, where, he was basically going to raise funds and do really good projects like build a hospice house or organize a farmer's market or something like that. That became plan B when plan A didn't work. And then he tried to infuse plan B with plan A, if that makes sense, with the spirit of plan A. But, so I mean, a lot of what we say does lead to an impression that this just can't be done. And yet, I guess I would argue that the experiments matter, and also that we can learn from them, and that if we simply sort of get the message that we should just sort of give up, then we become part of the problem. So somehow Christians have to figure out how to avoid that trap that so many people have fallen into, of personal piety, of retreat, like what we started off talking about on this one. Somehow they have to move past that. Maybe not as far as doing a Mundao kind of, experiment in like alternative housing, but something, or else we are simply those counter-revolutionaries that that the author that you were quoting is talking about, the sort of shallow counter-revolutionary that just reacts in the moment, does a little something, and then retreats back into the comfortable environment that they're used to.
As soon as they won some concession that appeases them.
Yeah, right. So, I mean, one way to get at this is maybe to ask you, like, we've spent some time with you and also Emily talking about the experiences of your own kind of quote failed experiment of Mort. And you have more or less like stayed and continued to operate, and now, under the name of John Paul II Catholic Worker Farm. But I know we've already talked about this to a certain extent, but I think it's kind of important here, since you directly have done something like this and are trying to push back. What has made you want to continue to stay in this? And, what's that like? And what would you say to people who would say, well, that's good for somebody like him, for the few somehow, more like whatever, but not for me. I can't do that.
Well, I would say I have a degree of socioeconomic privilege, which allows me to not be courting like utter financial devastation by doing this. That's one thing. And then arguably another kind of privilege is I have pretty strong convictions, I guess. I thought they were normal. You and subsequent life experience has convinced me that actually it's not normal to have these pretty strong convictions about how we should be living our lives.
It's not. It should be, but it's not. No.
And so I guess I would argue that dual privilege has kept me at it. Plus a certain getting stuck in a sunk cost fallacy that I've spent a fair amount of time and energy here. And so leaving would require a certain amount of loss there.
You think it's a fallacy? I mean,
no. Well, usually the sunk cost fallacy is just, that's its name.
Okay. I want to make sure I know exactly how to take that. But that, in other words, that's partly the way you're thinking is like, I put enough time into this. I want to see if I can get something.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
And the question is, will I dig myself deeper into a hole or not?
Right. Well, yeah.
And that's to say that that's in the mix as well. And then also it's compared to what? Like, where will I really go? What would I really do?
yeah. Would something else be better?
And thus far, I don't think so. There's nothing on my horizon that would be clearly better.
Mm-hmm. Well, part of the reason I ask is because I think that, the letter writer that you were referring to a while ago that was kind of scolding you guys about mixing the name Marx with JP2. I want people to, I guess, really contemplate how hard it is and how rare it is for people, especially, I guess, focusing on young people, to decide that they're going to give their lives to this kind of work, to kind of answer the call to a certain level of conviction and striving for holiness, and then putting that into action. That's what we say. That's what we say we want, and I think that one of the things that, in sort of being adjacent to this project and being a part of it to a certain extent, and certainly listening to all of your experiences, I'm often disappointed that people aren't more supportive, because that's what they say they want to see out of young people, and out of everybody, obviously, but and in people who do this kind of thing, who take these risks, which I grant, you have to have a certain amount of wherewithal to hang in that long, but they should be encouraged. You could be out, just basically pillaging in the real estate business or something. I don't know what you would otherwise be doing if you weren't so inclined, but you might not be doing good things for the world, and you're trying. And I think that before we engage with people who are really trying to do something good, we ought to stop and think, how can I encourage them? And then secondly, how can I also participate, right? How can I get involved, either in that project or in something like it, or start one of my own and then hook up to it, right? So, and where do I think that comes from? The other reaction, I think it comes from sort of conditioning, that, our society is so conditioned to think in terms of right and left, and the big political battle, which weirdly is still about capitalism and communism, which just is, strikes me as very anachronistic and strange in 2023. But that's literally where even a lot of people are at that aren't, that are under 50. We've got to get past this type of conditioned response, a sort of Pavlovian, oh, I see something that's not exactly what I expected, and it's not what I think is exactly right. Therefore, my first job is to repel it somehow.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Or the reverse, just sort of blandly affirm it because I do like it, but it's not going to take anything substantial from me.
Right. Which is not a whole lot more helpful. Yeah.
I would say, before I answer that second question, it occurred to me that I didn't answer the second part of your question before that, which is why don't other people what would you say to other people who might be interested in this?
Yeah.
And I mean, you largely answered what I was going to say, that work with, support people that are immediately around you, join them to the extent you can. And I would just add to that, I don't understand why, if not to say that, just going back to that post-mortem, if we had gotten, if instead of having all those horror stories, if like 25 to 50% of them had led to sustained good things, maybe Mort wouldn't have failed. Like maybe it would still exist.
Mm-hmm.
But instead of, and I don't, for sure, we've had some support here and there from, and especially the Greens. You've met Daniel. There are like little angels in our lives that, I don't know why I said little, but there are angels in our lives that have like helped us out. And that is for sure true. But on the whole, we've been treated either indifferently, or I would argue in a roundabout way, taken advantage of. And because of that, like, Mort failed. And it's not self-evident to me why, for instance, the developers have to keep developing whatever. Disney has to keep buying up all the other movie companies. That this coexists and is aided and abetted by people making decisions to purchase from like corporations and to invest their money in the stock market, which is fueling all of this. If their money and resources went to local things, we would have, to some extent, a different world.
Oh, sure. Yeah. If we all did that, or even if a fairly decent percentage of us did more of that, we would have a different world. And I would just say, like, again, the first step is maybe just holding your tongue, before you say anything. My mom used, I like, don't say anything if you can't say something nice, right? Whatever. I'll probably bleep that out. But like I think that we have to try to be as supportive of each other as we can be when we see other people doing things, trying to do the right thing, and join them if possible. And try not to get into personalistic disputes, because I think that happened a lot in your history, right? Like it came down to sort of weird, petty, personalistic disputes about things that didn't matter all that much. And that often derails people. So.
Yeah, except part of where we're at is we already had a temperament towards this, but I think we've become just increasingly vicious. Vicious in the sense of like dominated by our vices. And so on the one hand, are these petty disputes? Sure. On the other hand, if our like narcissistic gratification is the most important thing, then from inside that subjective position, it is not petty at all. It is the most important thing in the world.
So it seems, yeah. And
so we live under this, Pope Benedict called it the dictatorship of relativism. And if you think deeply about that relativism, if you take it past, if these professors quit being postmodern moral relativists, and if people would just go to church, then everything would be fine, because nobody wants to confront that our entire social order is a relative against the common good, the environment, and families at a deep fundamental level.
Right.
And the only way out of that, whether you identify as someone on the right or the left, would be concerted, sustained, revolutionary action with other people.
Which doesn't mean, just to make clear, it doesn't mean, taking up arms. Most Americans, when they hear revolutionary action, they think, we're getting our muskets and we're going to like shoot at the balloon in the sky or whatever the heck they're doing now, but like, sure. It's acting contrary to the existing system is what you're talking about, right?
Right. Yes. Although, I mean, to be honest, at a certain point, surely violence would get involved. Like if you reach some sort of capacity to actually challenge the status quo, you do have to. I just think, like, from a realist perspective.
Oh, yeah, right. If you actually got to the level of interfering with the workings of the economy, the government would probably be of
Right.
necessity trying to stop that. Right.
Right. At which, yeah, at the point that you pose a political threat, which this is so far beyond. If you're someone that wants a radical change in American society, we're so far beyond that. That, yeah.
Yeah.
Nor am I like glorifying or celebrating that, but
No, God forbid that would, yeah, but I do tend to agree. However, I think that it could just very well be that if somehow we could get efforts like this going on a larger scale, we could do a lot before we ever got to the point where the government would even be even really all that concerned, by which time I'm afraid the pressures of climate change and all the stuff related to it are going to be coming from the other direction. And then if you had enough, like built up human organizational infrastructure to deal with it, maybe the government wouldn't even have the capacity to resist it.
I mean, it's the Lenin quote about they were able to take over because power was lying in the streets. And they just went out and took it.
And that could very well happen. And that might be a pretty good reason for getting involved in building structures of, resilience at whatever level, of doing things with other people, of trying to like detach to a certain extent from too much reliance on the economic system as it is, at whatever level you can, because we may reach a point where people really, really need that, and where there is a vacuum, certainly has happened in other parts of the world, sometimes not for the better, but where a power vacuum occurs because the government is decrepit or cannot handle its job, and there are sub organizations of society that come to the fore, right? So, I mean, something similar could happen, but yeah, it's
sure. Although, especially in America, with how big we are, it's pretty unlikely, I think, at least in the short run.
Well, yeah, I mean, yeah, and our culture is, if small communities rose up that were quasi-autonomous, I'm afraid in America they'd be heavily armed, and basically we'd have warlord situation. So that's certainly one way in which the subunits can come to the fore against a weak government and not create a good scenario at all. That's interesting. That took a really kind of dark futuristic turn, didn't it?
Yeah. Well, but part of it, when you're just looking at like the rudiments of like our currently existing politics and where things seem to be trending, and like where things seem to be trending economically, who thinks that like we're in store for a better future in the short term?
Yeah, I know I can tell you that I don't have students now that have that kind of sense that their future is going to be better. I don't. Like, it's not whether, employment is running hot or whatever. There's a sense that they don't really have like that higher purpose. They're not aiming at any higher good. And I really feel like it's weighing on them. And they can see that. I mean, most of them do see the climate change issue as important. The economy is, there's maybe quite a few jobs, but those jobs tend to not be good. I was just talking to a guy today who did have job opportunities and resisted some of them because they were just bad jobs that he didn't want to do. And that's happening more and more to people. So yeah, I think that a lot of folks are not envisioning the future as better, better than their parents' future. That's not a thing right now. And it was for a great deal. But the past optimism in America was largely built on this notion that this economy from that's really like the 1950s was like the boom, like, and since the 1950s, there's been this, fantasy that the economy can always grow and provide like that. And that it will somehow create stability, and, it will continue to like grow, and it'll all be okay, in the end, everybody will, but this is not self-evident at all anymore. And I think a lot of students know that.
No, that I think the subtitle of The Culture of Narcissism was American Life in an Age of Diminishing Expectations.
Right. Yeah. And those diminishing expectations are not spiritually satisfying at all.
Mm-hmm. Right. And not only are they not spiritually satisfying for the individuals, they're not going to grant the surplus money for you to give alms or imagine reconstituting society along better lines.
Right. Yeah. The kind of capital that you're talking about sort of supporting you to a certain extent is going to be less and less. Yeah. In a lot of people's future is, as they become like riddled with debt and the price of everything goes up, and, like for so many of them, debt is just like, is going to hold them back so much. Where would they ever get? The only thing about that is, though, if people become that, I guess, precarious, then they might actually have to deal with each other. I know a growing number of people are living with roommates past their college years, and are starting to like live together, pool resources, but one gets the sense that it's very contractual, like you pay 50% of the rent and half the bills, and we see each other every once in a while.
Right. And where this connects to both to the Kansas City subplot and to a lesser extent with the pastors is they're not doing the work to understand how the world works. And even if they did that, they're not going about trying to positively impact the world. Right. I mean, look at my aunt. I think it's a fair interpretation of what she says that, when I pushed her on, do you think this could have turned out better if Mort had worked out and we'd been able to kind of organize for you, and you could have paid us the substantial fund of money that just went down the drain to this professional lawyer. Mm-hmm. And then two, what would you do differently? I asked her if you could go back in time a decade or two, what would you do differently? Mm-hmm. And her answer is, well, I would have gotten to know my congressperson more. Or not congressperson, city council person.
Local leaders, that she should have spent a lot more time with them, and she didn't need to hire the lawyer. But she didn't really actually address the suggestion, did she, of you guys kind of helping organize the resistance?
Because both of them are too radical. Because in the one, what we're talking about is like local organizing and a kind of, we're talking about community organizing. Mm-hmm. And in the other one, why would being on good terms with your council person count more than most of the council people being bought off?
It doesn't. It's kind of relatively similar. Basically, it's an acknowledgement that familiarity does bring power, which is sad but true. I mean, she's basically right that, that would be a more effective strategy than the lawyer. But I think that, organizing the tenants and the people in the area was just maybe a bridge too far. And that's, I guess, hard for a lot of people to even imagine doing that. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yep.
And that's hard to imagine, let alone, I would like to live in a world where like the position of landlord is basically abolished. But, we're not talking about a radical self-critique. We're talking about, do you think maybe you should have done something more radical than gotten on friendly terms with your council person?
Right.
Really think that would be adequate for you to stand up to the coming wave of gentrification?
Well, so both of those options are so much, they either getting the lawyer or like directly politicking are normal, socially acceptable ways of dealing with like conflict, right? And they feel comfortable and safe compared to dealing with people that maybe are unpredictable or have their own ideas and stuff. I think that's part of it, obviously, right? Like trying to organize people is like trying to herd cats as well, and comes with all sorts of frustrations. I remember talking to Nick a long time ago. Remember that? It was like in season 1 where it was all about like resisting fracking in Pennsylvania. And, it was herding cats. Like he tried to organize people. And of course, you guys would have been perhaps more effective because you would have gone into it with a little bit more knowledge at that point of what it takes. Nick like admitted he didn't know how hard it was going to be, right? But anyway.
And just to be clear, I'm not talking about in this instance doing much more than like fomenting like local public disdain for Mac properties and having way more of a push at the council meeting to maybe make these council people think their cushy position would be jeopardized.
Right. Which is really normal political activity, that
really
is,
just
It's
bridging the gap
possible.
between my aunt and Casey tenants.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. The biggest challenge there is literally like sustaining it. It seems to me, I've seen quite a few of these efforts over the years, and they'll be able to get some folks out for a while, but then people lose interest and it kind of falls apart. So it takes this really sustained effort, and somebody has to be behind it that's really kind of single-minded, which is hard to find. But which, I mean, that kind of gets me back to, I feel like I'm whining or something, but I really feel like, so what we're basically saying is, you, again, entrepreneur, you figure out the best way to like deal with the fact that your little neck of the woods which is a part of this overall like fabric that we've been talking about, the bigger picture, but you're kind of like responsible for defending this section of it. Now you figure out, what to do about that out of whole cloth. Like you become like the idea person who figures out how to deal with the deck that's totally stacked against you, right? Because the church, the number one organization in society that says that it cares about stuff like this, is nowhere to be found when it comes to leadership on it. But imagine if you had like a church, like to a certain extent, labor unions used to be somewhat in this category, right? But our system has decimated labor unions.
When we still had a working class movement and when capital could afford that luxury. Yeah, go ahead.
Right. Like you could say, oh, the labor union, that's where I'll go to protect our interests, like in this working class community here. At least I can go, if it's not a labor issue, at least I can get some like organization going within this larger organization, because people are used to they're used to cooperating and dealing with each other. But that's all been destroyed. Sure. So where's the one place in this society where people still go on a regular basis, at least some of them, and others at least are members and go occasionally, and that profess values like caring for your neighbor, trying to combat poverty, protecting the environment. Some of them, not most of them, as we learn, don't even talk about that. But like, I insist at the highest levels, they usually have some statement about it, but whatever. But they do talk a lot about community and caring for your neighbor, right? And local businesses even, and, sort of like supporting each other. And where are they? It doesn't even occur to them to provide leadership in that area for the most part. So what if, you could go to your church and say, I'm having this problem. People are going to be thrown out of their homes, or, the rent's going to rise to the point where they can't afford it. Oh, we'll like organize something and we'll push back and we'll bring our moral authority to bear, which the individual does not have. But the church claims to have moral authority. We'll bring that to bear, and we'll push back, and we'll maybe embarrass these people for their total greed. I don't know. Like that's what I would like to see in my wildest dreams. And that's what I kept asking in those interviews in a variety of ways, like, what's the role of the church? Do you see a role of the church in providing housing, organizing people to like take care of each other in a variety of ways? And for the most part, it just wasn't there.
Yeah. Well, and part of what came to my mind when you were saying that is, I think people, especially like privileged people, like to a degree, most pastors are, like they're higher-ish up on the socioeconomic ladder. They're still living like basically the breakdown of neoliberal, or the alpha bunga bunga guys call it knobs, neoliberal order breakdown syndrome, which they attribute to like a lot of the social craziness going on. We're like recalibrating, and knobs hasn't yet hit a number of the people we've been interviewing. And so they're still imagining that they can be neutral on these issues.
Mm-hmm.
And what that means, like one of the things that came to me, one of those pregnant pauses we had was when we asked Swan about the environment, and he made a comment. He talked about aesthetics for a while, and he made the comment about basically it's not that most Catholics, or I don't remember if he even meant Catholics or conservatives, but it's not that they're opposed to taking care of the environment. They're opposed to he called it the politicization, which I want to come back and unpack what that probably means. They're opposed to the politicization of the environment. But if they own land, and he had an example of like, you see a deer, you like want to look at the beauty of the deer, you want to help take care of the deer. But he's accepted that there's a split between politics and what it takes to take care of that deer.
Mm-hmm.
And part of where all these Catholics and conservatives and the shallow counter-revolutionaries, if you will, have settled into the status quo is they've accepted that to care about the environment is to, if you care about that, then you are sucked into left liberal progressive politics. Will be one nation under globo homo or whatever. And therefore, that's what environmentalism means politically. That is the issue as it presents itself to them.
Mm-hmm. Right. So that signifier is something they want to avoid, which is why they don't talk about it.
Right. And because even if you do the work to be like, I'm not an American conservative, I'm a distributivist. I believe we should own small tracts of land, and I believe we should, care for the wildlife on our property. Is like, great. Okay. I'm so glad that you see that. Are you doing that at your scale? Like the regeneration podcast guys that you interviewed. Are you doing that at your scale? And if they are, which now we're talking about like a minority of a minority and a minority. If they are doing that, then it's like, okay, are you teamed up with other people to like actually allow this model that you think is politically and socially and spiritually and anthropologically correct? What are you doing to revolutionarily organize to make that a possibility for other people, and therefore like solidify your position? Nothing.
Right. Or they would say, I'm the only thing I'm doing there is I'm giving an example that people could also do.
Right. They can figure it out themselves.
Right. But then, we're all kind of just, basically living a pious life if we do that. Yeah.
Right. Not even the milquetoast idea of like, let's say we're distributivist. We should be supporting credit unions that are like actively pushing to enable other people to acquire productive property.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And I would, and facilitating the spread of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. In other words, taking it to that next level where you're moving within society, taking some political action in that larger sense of trying to move in society to create the conditions for people to do it.
But all of that requires activity, that requires working with other people, that may or may not pay off. And also, to give them the benefit of the doubt, it involves interfacing with a reality that is hard to understand.
Sure. In the
you know?
sense that what? It's unpredictable.
And it also, it's unpredictable, but also your interpretation to a large extent depends on the categories you bring to it. And then you can try and like empirically assess, were my categories accurate or were they not? But most people don't do that even when they fail. So, Hawkeye, my Aunt Mary, she admits, oh, her categories were wrong. Well, okay, so what should you have done differently? Well, I'm just going to slightly modify my categories. Because,
well, I mean, in the case of your Aunt Mary, I think she's sort of like debating how long she's sort of going to hang in there until she can't anymore. And then she's going to get out because she's kind of like, I've had it. So,
right. I meant more when I asked her if you could go back in time, what would you do differently?
Okay, yeah.
Similarly, with Dan Kroll, he put out this post out there, let's have an adult discussion, let's not just complain about capitalism. And we said, great, let's talk about it. And he's like, well, I don't know, capitalism's like, my takeaway from that talk was him saying, well, capitalism is like basically good and or all we've got. And so there's really not like an adult discussion to have about it other than let's just try again.
Yeah, I thought that was really interesting. As when it came right down to it, I felt like he was that he was defending capitalism quite a bit because he sensed that we were critical of it. And for what, maybe it's just reflexive, but and ultimately he his model really seemed to stay at the level of we need these corporate people to give us land and stuff and to cooperate with money and stuff. So we can kind of like ride that the crest of that wave as far as we can take it. And then if we have to, we can get off and then try to find another wave to ride.
And also, did you notice the jump when he kind of admitted, I don't really know how to like beyond education, I don't know how to change things in the short run, but I'm planting trees that will grow for 400 years.
Yeah, right. I did. And that's a nice move, as far as making it feel a little bit better when you have to deal with a major disappointment. I think that's a move people often make is, well, what I'm doing is intrinsically good, even if the results don't totally come to fruition, or if it's like, it could be that it'll happen long after I'm dead, but at least I've kind of contributed to it. And it's not totally wrong, but I think it's a very comforting move that people make.
Right. To make this kind of like Camusian existentialist, like at least I'm like owning what I did and I did the best I could with what I have.
Yes.
A kind of heroic liberal stance.
Yes. And that's a pitfall that I sometimes find myself falling into. I have a tendency to say, well, I'm just going to do the right thing. I don't know, what the outcome will be, or even if there is an outcome, but that's my responsibility, is to do the right thing. And again, it's not like it's bad in and of itself to think that way, but to sort of like consistently allow that to then basically excuse you from trying a different angle or a different tack, or learning from your mistakes, and and then not repeating them. That's not good. So but everybody does it to a certain extent, I think.
Sure. But for me, the question is it a stepping stone to other things, or is that just the end point?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What did you think, but by the way, about, he didn't really address the point I made that they could buy a whole ton of like cheap land in a different part of the city that wasn't like downtown Kansas City, where real estate is expensive.
Mm-hmm.
But they wanted to have their project right downtown so that the people living in these complexes could walk out their door and see the garden and stuff like that. And it could be this educational opportunity.
Mm-hmm.
But there they probably couldn't buy that land. They would have to have it like given to them for free to lease by a corporate builder.
Part of the capitalist realism he's accepted is the land is that expensive there. Let's not think too hard about why that is and whether or not that's right or not, because it just is.
This is just the way it has to be. And I
And
think he had more or less like assumed off the bat that it's, which is true, that it's not profitable to do that. So therefore, the only option for an urban farm is as an educational tool, you know, and a sort of beautification project.
right, which I think is true. I think especially if you're doing some urban farming, are you doing education? Are you doing real estate? Are you doing social work? Like, what is your niche that is actually societally reinforced? Because it will not be the small scale farming.
Right. It's in a lot of projects, it's all three. But the last thing it is actually provision of food for people, because it isn't profitable at all. Right.
The reality is capitalism has made that type of thing superfluous.
Right. And again, like, to get back to your point about action, in order to make it doable at all, in order to make like food security a reality in cities, you really literally would have to have like government action. So that was a part of that.
You would have to politicize it.
Yeah, exactly. Right. At even the local level, like even city could do that.
And we would have to constitute a we.
Right. Right. Yep. We'd have to, at least at the municipal level, if not higher, make it a priority to support that kind of economy. So, but, like, people, including city governments, want to have it both ways. They want to brag that they've got this vibrant local economy with unique, businesses and opportunities and great local food. But at the same time, they spend a lot of money and effort giving major companies big tax breaks, right, to move into areas like the building next to your aunt's, properties, which isn't even like they've got store space and no one wants to go in there right now because that whole thing sounds like a boondoggle. But, it reflects the priorities of the city for real, which don't really align with the local economy being all that vibrant. But you know more about this than I do, so.
Yeah, and that's one species of utopian socialism is, on the one hand, saying you want Main Street capitalism, not Wall Street, but at the end of the day, they're two sides of the same coin. But it's weighted towards Wall Street.
Yes.
And
it certainly is.
And nobody wants to be, or very few people want to be adult enough to have that discussion, it seems to me.
Right. And I think that, when Larry Chapp was in the conversations we had as well, we talked a lot about Catholic social teaching with him too. And that this is a place where Catholic social teaching has a real contribution to make in informing of the value of supporting vibrant local economy and preferring the small and the more personal to the large and impersonal for social, moral, ethical, spiritual reasons. You can't have the neighborliness, right, and the love of neighbor that the Christian wants if they're also like not at all linking that up with what they eat, what they buy, the transactions that they make. If all of those are extremely impersonal and they bypass and the faceless people around them to go to the faceless, corporate provider, how can they be neighborly? So, there's a real contribution to be made there, but, people are not getting that message and they need to get that message. That's part of what we're about, is trying to get that message out there.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of annoying to me because I don't understand why it isn't common sense, but it was it was wild to me when I brought up the question of like, to what extent are environmental pollutants making us, I think the example was transsexual, but it could all sorts of things. Have you connected up all the environmental pollutants with you saying this is God's creation and you're pro-life? And he's like, nope, nobody's ever brought that up. It's like he lives in a world, at least as I understand it, he lives in a world of talk and ideas.
Right, like a lot of intellectuals, and he at least kind of owns it. They tend to sort of expect that it will kind of like trickle down to everybody through, moving from the academic space into discussions out there in the real world and then beyond. But yeah, like I think that it was really interesting to see that pause as he sort of digested that point. And we should probably unpack that point a little bit. But he literally said he had never really considered that and that he was going to think about it. But basically what you're talking about is like in a world in which everything is interchangeable, flexible, fungible, and fluid, okay, when it comes to our consumer choices and our lifestyles, the things that we wear, the cars that we drive, the games that we play, the TV shows that we watch. We're constantly having all of these choices, and we're constantly being churned in our identities.
And your job could get offshore to somewhere else.
Yeah, and then you have to remake yourself and reinvent yourself, which is an entire like concept now, that you have to constantly reinvent yourself in order to adapt to the changing economy and to our very always rapidly changing cultural trends that reflect that changing economy, right? So we are so used to thinking in terms of constant adaptation, and we're also trained to think that our freedom is in our freedom to choose and to consume, right? Especially to choose what we consume. And so it should not come as a surprise that personal identity is at the forefront in people's minds, especially as they're trying to grapple with finding some sort of anchor in this world, of constant flux. And so they turn to, well, who am I, right? What is my core identity? And in the environment that we're in, we experience that as we've got a lot of choices, just like I have a lot of choices in like the consumer products that I buy or the hair color that I wear or whatever it is. I have a choice of my identity. And that has had some liberating effects for people in a lot of ways. And it has had some deleterious effects for people. But what's shocking is that conservatives who like are so supportive of the capitalist economy and have no problem with neoliberal economics don't see the connection between their preferred economic principles and the type of fluidity of identity that is now expressing itself in transsexuality and other forms of identity seeking, right? It
Right.
should not be surprising at all.
Unless, to quote Rao, they have a shallow political position.
Right. They are not seeing the connections.
And I would also rephrase what you're saying. Because at least both Mundal and Swan both talked about how there's this increasing trend towards basically like techno-Gnosticism. We want to like live in our screens. We want to escape our bodies. Why would you be surprised that more and more people are going down those routes, whether it's like my identity is at variance with my body, as one example that at least, like Swan's position would bemoan, while meanwhile, he has never thought about how environmental pollutants are affecting other people. Like he already implicitly has a Gnostic body-soul dichotomy model of how this stuff works. And that's why they're so obsessed with talking about the culture and using words to change people's ideas, because the irony is like they think Marx is wrong for being fully materialist, but then meanwhile, they're basically fully spiritual. At least like in their worldview of how things work.
Right. But the Catholic perspective does encourage the mind-body connection.
Right.
In reality, it does.
Right. Chalcedonian Christianity,
Mm-hmm.
body
Right.
and soul.
Yes. Not one without the
Two,
other.
two natures, one person.
Mm-hmm. So our material circumstances greatly affect our souls.
Right. Which is not to say that they are one-to-one with our souls.
Mm-hmm.
And there is no spiritual reality.
Right. But they are, at least while we're here on earth, unified. They are one piece, or you can't just separate the two. And so the conditions of the world affect who we are in a very deep and serious way. I remember I don't know. It's weird now. How long has it been? 20 years maybe since I first experienced the idea of an avatar, right? So at a certain point, as the internet developed and people started to do online games and things like that and be able to go into online spaces, you could make yourself be whatever you wanted to be. So you could go into that environment as a person of the opposite sex, or looking very differently than you normally look, or even being some sort of animal or whatever you wanted. And I think it now feels perfectly normal, but at the time I was like, wow, this is I'm not even sure what this is all for, or whether it's good or not, but it did feel extremely liberating. I will say that, because you had a certain amount of anonymity. But the reason I'm thinking of this is because, think of the billions that have been made off of online, gaming environments, as well as other forms of gaming, and now virtual reality. It's just a big part of our economy now. Nobody's arguing that we need to get rid of any of that. Mm-hmm. Even though it's largely a waste of time and it's a little weird and it doesn't involve creating human relationships. It's the opposite in a way. Mm-hmm. I don't know. I'm probably,
although, you trace it back materially, Google somewhere Google has built a giant dam that's probably messing with how fish reproduce and how the water flows. They built a huge dam so they can have a huge server farm. Mm-hmm. And machines are whirring away so that we can pretend that we're somebody we're not.
Mm-hmm. All of which continues to affect our actual real environment. Mm-hmm. And our futures, and even our, reproductive health now. To get back to the impact directly on the body, our fertility rates are going way down. Puberty is happening faster and faster due to all sorts of introduction of hormones in our meat and pollutants in our food. It's so grossly affected our bodies, diabetes, cancer. We could go into a litany of this, but obviously the price is really high.
Mm-hmm. But any of these things, you as an individual are not just figuring out for yourself.
Right.
And so we're at a loss with how to confront them. And for me, honestly, it was a little bit gut wrenching when the anonymous pastor, who we both know pretty well, I'm not super tight, but when he said, I haven't thought much about climate change, is I've pressed the point home to him. If after my influence, forget about changing your life or whatever, if after encountering me, he's never really thought about the implications of climate change,
then it's probably not going to happen.
Yeah. And in 2023, and I don't want to be a rad lib talking about I haven't been seen or heard, although I haven't been with him. Mm-hmm. But also it's 2023, and are we not just back at kind of Nick's story about he's running around trying to organize people while meanwhile they're literally already fracking out from under him. Right. I feel like to a large degree, and I don't want to be disrespectful to these pastors. They've done the best they can, But my takeaway, like in the abstract, my takeaway from these interviews is they're not getting to the radical core of what's wrong with our society.
Right.
And preaching that to people, and maybe those people being empowered to do something about it. Would you say that's fair?
I think that's fair. And I think we're basically saying we expect them to do that. Like,
Well, define expect. I would like.
no, I mean, like, expect not in the sense that I think it's going to happen, but like morally, I expect them to do that. And I think that people need to like hear that, and if they agree, they need to start making that point themselves. If you have a pastor who's never talked about the environment the entire time you've been sitting in church, say something about it. But I don't know if any of that helps or not. But yes, like, I expect them, because my son's future literally is on the line. Like, everybody's future is on the line. And this is the most important social issue that we face. And so I don't think it's acceptable to have that pregnant pause. As much as I liked all of these guys, it was kind of like dismaying to see how little most of them had really thought it through.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're saying, think it through,
And even it was interesting to me that when Dawn said that, because I would expect the anonymous conservative pastor to maybe have not thought about climate change. I mean, I'd hope differently for this specific one, given our personal knowledge of each other. But even the more left liberal Episcopalians apparently have only very recently started thinking about the environment.
Right. Yeah. And one of the reasons that was given by some of them, I can't remember whether Don mentioned this, but he probably did, is that, the people like don't want to hear it. Well, no, Don wasn't one of them, because he made the point that maybe there was some hope, because at least Episcopalian pastors many of them were just lay people now who aren't going to get paid. So they wouldn't have to worry as much about whether people wanted to hear it or not, because they wouldn't be getting fired. So I thought that was a good point. But like, but for a lot of them, it's like literally, if we say something about this, our people will like zip the purse, Well, I'm sorry, but if you got into being a pastor so that you could basically not say something on that basis,
No.
think again.
But and then and to rephrase that question, it's to what extent you're basically calling for pastors to have like a martyric apocalyptic stance and sort of like prophetically tell the truth.
Yes, I guess I am.
Versus be what Larry Chapp calls de facto atheists, or to put it in extreme terms.
Yeah, that's pretty stark. But yes, like, I do think, and it's not like everyone has to go out and completely, self-implode to make this point. You could do far less and still do something and prove that it could be said, right? Like, to never say anything in a church for years about this very important issue, to never organize anything to educate your people or to help them respond to it. It's like, it's extreme non-action, so yes, like, in my heart of hearts, this kind of like more, I will, if necessary, sacrifice myself for the greater good is probably the thing I would expect a pastor to do. But they could do far less than that, and I would be surprised, and happily so. So like, to say that I'm disappointed is probably an understatement, actually. And it wasn't because of these interviews. I mean, I already knew. I've been a Christian my whole life, so I've sat in a lot of church services, and I don't think I've ever heard a single sermon on this topic, okay, ever in my entire life. So I wasn't surprised at these answers, but it's still very disappointing. And I think that the church is a place where we ought to be able to look for hope and guidance on these matters.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think we're asking, especially the Catholic Church, because that's what we're a part of, to do that and to listen to its own teachings and to teach them to people instead of being afraid of the donor.
Yeah. And what I mean, and where, I got pulled in last year is like I was convinced, okay, like intellectually, morally, this seems to be, the fullness of the faith. When we talk about like integral ecology, integral liberation, it's the idea of like liberating every part of us in the truth of who we are and what reality is. And part of it is that calls us to be more profound, to explore what that fullness is.
Right. And be willing to take risks, but to put in the time and the work to understand at a more complex, holistic level, and then to actually put in some effort in whatever way you can with other people. So,
Right.
I mean, one of the things I hope the Morin Academy does is help people think of ways to do that and maybe to move beyond that at some point, but that's probably a conversation for another day.
Right. Yeah, well, and we've been talking for a while, but I guess, I mean, the parting thought comes to mind because so it's Holy Thursday now when we're recording. Emily's going to get baptized on Holy Saturday, I guess it's called.
Right.
Easter Vigil.
Easter Vigil.
And I mean, I was joking with Emily, but I'm kind of serious too, that like there's going to be a lot of people coming just to see Emily. Like Emily is going to have more of a turnout than, because we've been going there for like at least a year when I started RCIA. Emily's going to have more turnout of people seeing her, at least from what I can tell, than probably literally everybody else who's been baptized or confirmed in the last year.
That's wild, man.
And
that's great.
And to some extent, that's a testimony to how the flip side of all of our complaining in the more post-mortem is that we have more genuine friendships or good acquaintances than most people. And that's been a byproduct of us trying to be more authentic and being in these social spaces where you are having more genuine personal interaction with other people. And it is a kind of reward, and maybe I would like to think a sign that we're on the right track.
Yeah, I think so. I would agree with that. Human relationships are the most important thing. They're the thing upon which everything else is based. If you're going to do anything good in the world, that's the foundation, and that's where we need to start. So, yeah, and congratulations to her on that milestone.
Right, and just to connect that to our interviews with the pastors, I mean, I think it is accurate to say it sounds like they've devoted their lives to trying to be friends with either their colleagues in the clergy, and with other people. And it seems like they haven't pushed it to the lengths that we would like to, but maybe the best we can hope for is the kind of friendship and pastoring that they are presenting. I don't know. I mean, does that sounds mealy mouth compared to what we've been talking about the rest of this episode, but
no, I think that is something that every one of them has done quite a bit of, and it is the foundation of everything else. And so, we've got some good role models in that respect. But we just need to think about what we can do with those relationships now, to kind of move forward a bit. So.
Yeah, and I think asking that question isn't to necessarily like instrumentalize those relationships or start treating people like objects that you're just manipulating.
No.
Because otherwise you're accepting this Gnostic split, or not, like semi-Gnostic split, that there's just our own like romantic with a capital R relationships with other people that are fully divorced from how we live our lives.
No, yeah. I think about maybe like offering a seminar at some point just on the topic of friendship, because friendship is, if it's done right, and I get some inspiration from Aristotle in this regard, it's based on shared values and it's based on shared activities. So it can't just be the romantic relationship with a capital R. It can only really form under real conditions. And that's why, yes, it's wrong to use people, but we're talking about working together, sharing the same values. If you don't have those things, then you don't have the most solid of friendships. And that type of friendship is very satisfying. It's very worthwhile. So it's worth striving for.
Definitely. And this reminds me of, at some point, I wish we'd asked him more about it. In the Mundal interview, he had this brief section where he talked about how he was having one of his like yearly it was something like a pastoral review session. And I think it was later in his career, they were having this review, and whoever was sort of like evaluating him, and presumably it was a committee of people, that they had some sort of breakthrough where they realized that they weren't in a kind of like teacher to his student relationship where they were like opposed and just like critiquing each other. They had some epiphany where they realized that like they were in this thing and like building the church together.
Yeah. Wow. An epiphany.
And part of what we've been complaining about this whole podcast, underlying it, has been that we feel that there is a division between what the church should be doing or teaching and then what's actually happening on the ground. There's this big chasm, owing in large part, I guess, to liberalism and everybody being divided, responsibility being demarcated. And then there's a huge gap between, even like in Catholicism, what the church teaches magisterially about social and ecological matters, and then what not just the laity, but even what the vast majority of the clergy is talking about.
Mm-hmm.
And part of that, underlying that, are these various splits where everybody's lost sight of the fact that we're in it together. We're responsible for our society and to the world and to God. And there's this widespread default on that responsibility. And we're back at that debonair nihilism, or the de facto atheism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Responsibility means sort of defragmenting, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like you hit the nail on the head. We have this very liberal notion that everybody has their role and only that role, and it only should go so far. And a lot of times that turns into some sort of weird situation like Tom's, right? Where he's literally dealing with people who ought to think of themselves as on the same team, but literally they're thinking of him as some sort of employee,
Mm-hmm.
They've forgotten that bigger picture. So, yeah.
And this hermeneutic you could apply to like our whole discussion about why does Swan object to the politicization of the environment? And it's because he conceives of politicizing the environment as like something that is inherently opposed to his conservative Catholicism.
Mm-hmm. Right. Because we are all stuck in grooves, and we need to get beyond them. What keeps coming to my mind is we just need to get serious. It's like we're all kind of stumbling around half drunk, on whatever the element of liberalism that makes you think narrowly. we're so drunk on that we can't see what's right in front of us. So we need to get sober and we need to get serious.